when our economy starts to improve, it's not going to be slow and steady. It's going to be erratic and stop-start and significant, and the property market's going to be the same.
The predictability of rising asset prices over time creates a well-trodden pathway for everyday people to build wealth. The curious thing, though, is that prices, no matter what market we're talking about, don't actually rise in a straight line. It's true with crypto, it's true with shares, and it's definitely true with property. And the more you zoom in, the more volatile things actually look. It becomes even curiouser when you zoom in and you then observe that most markets follow cycles or patterns. The question becomes, are these cycles reliable? Because if they are, and if we can change our property buying decisions based on a property cycle, for example, that means that we can buy property at lower prices than other people can. And more importantly, we can sell property at higher prices. So that's what today's conversation is about, and I'm honored to have Kieran Trass, the author of Grow Richer with the Property Cycle, and he's going to be here with me today in the studio. And if you get some value out of this episode, please give this one a like, and I would love to know if you agree or disagree with the property cycle theory. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin.
いただきます。
Kieran Trass, thank you for joining me today. Property investor, mentor, author of 6 books, one of them in my hometown, Canada. So thank you for coming in and having a chat with me
You're
today.
welcome.
Cool. Let's start off with a question that I've asked a couple of people recently, and I know that your perspective, your answer to this will be different to many others. So if you were to guess what, say, the mainstream media is alluding to when they mention the term housing crisis, what do you think they're referring to?
Social housing, not enough. Affordability for first home buyers and lack of dwellings.
Right.
So if you look at those three, social housing, we've got a problem. The government spends $4 billion a year and supporting people to pay the rent and to live somewhere. That's a major problem, right? So that is a housing crisis there. When you talk about supply of buildings, new builds, we've got over 4,000 new buildings for sale in Auckland right now that are listed, and that doesn't represent all of the stock because some developers will only advertise one new build, but they've got 6. There is no shortage of houses right now. There is no undersupply, okay? But everyone carries that around because it was true for a while. People don't realise it's no longer true. It will become true again. But right now, today, it's wrong to say we have a housing crisis because we don't have enough houses, a housing shortage. I went to a property investor meeting about a year ago, or a bit longer. 4 parties were represented there. They all said exactly the same thing. We all know we've got a housing crisis. We don't have enough houses. We actually do have enough right now, but that will change. Come back to affordability though, because this is really the big one, as I think people say, oh, well, property's unaffordable. First home buyers have been priced out of the market. A whole generation will never own their own homes. You've heard it all, right? And especially from politicians, maybe even economists or reporters from the news. The reality is, based on the minimum income, if you have a young couple flipping burgers right now, they can actually borrow $500,000 to buy a property.
See, that's very contrary to what
Today.
I think most people
Today.
think. Yeah, right, today.
Go to the BNZ bank calculator and put the numbers in. It'll tell you they can borrow $500,000, which means they can spend $600, but they've got to come up with $100. And what they really can't do is save that $100. So we actually have a deposit crisis right now. And the evidence is right in front of us because just last month, 40% of first home buyers borrowed more than 80%. So what does that tell us? Is it unaffordable for them to borrow that money and pay the mortgage? No, because they wouldn't get the mortgage otherwise. It's the deposit that is actually the issue. The government should be addressing that issue, and that would solve the housing crisis in respect of first home buyers.
Can you unpack what you mean by that? So if you say the government should solve the deposit crisis, we'll call it, are you saying the government should come up with like a cash grant for first home buyers?
Well, they've just scrapped the homeowner grant, haven't they? But look to Australia. Don't have to look far. We've got shared equity. I have a relative that got into a property on shared equity. The property market's gone up a lot. Fantastic deal. Been able to get out of that, buy his own home, and that's been a real game changer for him. He never would have bought the property otherwise because he couldn't have saved the deposit. So shared equity is one. Maybe an interest-free loan. Look, go back in history, back to the 70s, the government, we had a problem back then of people not being able to afford the deposit. So what they did is they gave them a suspensory loan, which was an interest-free loan for 7 years, providing you stayed in the house. You didn't have to pay any interest on that loan. And then after 7 years, your income's gone up, everything's changed, the property's worth more, you can just finance it back through a bank. So that worked a treat in the 70s, got tens of thousands of people took advantage of that. So we can do it, we've done it before, and we can do it. Of course, everyone goes, where's the money coming from? And I'm saying the money you're spending right now, the $4 billion a year that you're using in social housing to prop up, that will actually reduce in the future generations, if you get people into their own homes. So focus, instead of trying to get every property priced down so it's affordable for everyone forever, which is a naive view, instead of that, just focus on the market that needs it, which is the first home buyers. Get them into properties. That's it. That's what they should do. That's a really a solid foundation to make a much better future.
Okay. I'm going to reference this book, so I
Sure.
need to do a quick plug of your book. So you've written 6 of these books. Grow Richer with the Property Cycle. That's the latest one. You actually mentioned before we hit record that there's another one coming up, but we won't talk about that just yet. There's quite a lot of interesting insights in this book. I last night read the chapter summaries just so I could remember what I read almost a year ago now. Somewhere in here, you reference a report. I can't remember if it was from the World Bank or some other international organization that linked or implied there was a housing crisis, I guess, which linked people's incomes to the actual house price itself.
The median multiple myth.
The median multiple myth. Can you break
Correct.
that down a little bit for
Okay,
me?
so in the early 1990s, when mortgage rates were 15%, the World Bank looked around the world and said, how do we compare countries in respect of housing affordability? So they came up with this measure and they said, oh, well, we'll just divide the median house price by the median income. And back then, because interest rates were about 15%, they came up with a figure that said if a property is more than 3 times your median income, then if that's the median income, property prices over that, then it's too expensive. And if it's 5 times or more, it's just insanely expensive, right? So it must come down to 3. Otherwise, it's not going to be affordable or sustainable. That was perfect when interest rates were 15%, but the world's moved on. And when interest rates came down to 5%, or they're in the 5s now, right? You can't use that same calculation because you're failing to account for the biggest cost of owning a property is the mortgage for most people. If you take that out and say we're not going to account for that cost, how can you measure affordability just by looking at the price of a property versus income when you're not actually looking at the cost of the mortgage? And that's the flaw. But that, unfortunately, that myth is so deeply embedded in people's psyche that it's quoted often in media articles. The median multiple's too high. Everyone talks about if it's over 3, it's unaffordable. But that's actually not relevant right now. If interest rates go back to 15%, I will be the first one to say, yeah, we've got a major problem. We haven't.
No one really actually pays the purchase price for property. They pay the mortgage payments. Yet this median multiple suggests that, well, it's not really apples for apples, it's apples for some other random fruit, because you're comparing income to an asset price, and they're not the same thing.
It makes sense when you think it.
If you're paying
You know,
cash, right?
when you think about it, it's like people go, "Oh, well, you had it easy. It used to be 3 times, yeah, but I didn't have it easy because the mortgage rate was actually 20%. You know, like when I bought my first home." But people just think that that's a solid comparison to make, and it's flawed because it's not consistent when you're not accounting for that largest cost of ownership
Yes.
for most people, especially a first home. I mean,
That's
who
right.
buys a first home without a mortgage? No one.
Hardly anyone. Would it be fair to say that if you were starting out again then, as a percentage of your after-tax income, getting into a first home back then, would that be similar in terms of affordability for you?
It's very similar. In fact, the banks used to allow 40% of gross income to be committed to mortgage payments. And in fact, 45% if you earned over 100,000 back then, which was a lot of money. So they would actually let you commit that much. If you run the numbers today on people committing that much of their income, the mortgage actually is affordable. I'm talking about entry level, of course, because
Yes,
we're talking about a
that's
first
right.
home buyer.
Yes.
And unfortunately, a lot of commentators talk about how property is so unaffordable for first home buyers, and what they do is they run the numbers and say, oh, look how much the mortgage payments are on a median priced property. Well, how many first home buyers buy a median priced property? If you run the numbers, you can tell very easily that a young couple can actually afford, like I said, that $500,000. They can buy a $600,000 property. In fact, if you've got a joint income of 110, you can actually spend 750 if you can save the 150 deposit. And that's where the problem is.
And we come back down to
We'll
that
come back
deposit
to it.
crisis. Okay. So I want to ask you another myth, which maybe it doesn't have a name. Maybe you can tell me if it does. Do property investors cause any affordability problem for first home buyers?
Yes, during a boom. Fact is, we do. We compete with first home buyers. Well, if you're buying entry level price properties, okay? But right now, not at all.
Okay.
There is virtually no competition.
So we shouldn't be angry at property investors right now.
No, well, actually, it's funny because the largest percentage of buyers right now are first home buyers, which is great. They should be buying, right? It's a good time, a really good time to buy your first home right now. Cyclically, we're in a sweet spot.
Yes.
And there's less competition from investors because, we've been hammered as investors from all quarters for a few years. So there's a bit of shell shock amongst investors, but that is starting to wane now as investors are starting to realise, wow, the numbers are starting to look quite good. And once interest rates hit 5%, we're not far off that now. Cheapest rate, I think, is about 5.6. Once we get to 5, suddenly these properties actually can pay for themselves based on renting them out.
Yes.
So investors are going to come back. And when they do, yes, it becomes more difficult for first home buyers, which is why first home buyers should take advantage of where we are right now. There's a huge surplus of stock, new builds. And by the way, I bought my first property in 1987. It was a 2-bedroom unit made of block. Okay, let's just talk about this because it's important. You talk about a warm, dry home. Yeah, this was block. It didn't even have jib board because the block was the insulation. Okay, it was a block building. And it was 2 bedrooms. I had to convert the basement to a bedroom so I could live there and get 2 flatmates. I had to have a full-time job and a part-time job. I had to sell my car, get a push bike and bus to work. No holidays. And I did all of that because I had to borrow most of the deposit as well. So it was no different to where we are today. And I learned, because I was in banking, I learned that if you push your income up and get some short-term loans that you can actually pay back, you can actually pay off that deposit over a short period of time, and then you're away. So, a lot of sacrifice. This is 1987. And then I look at people today who are buying brand new, beautiful properties, like unbelievable luxury, AC and all of that. I look back at what I bought, I'm like, wow, yeah, boomers, we had it. Yeah, we had it so easy, apparently.
One of my other questions was it easier back in your day? I guess we've kind of answered that in a few different ways, but I think maybe to a certain extent we become quite addicted to the comforts of today and maybe don't fully appreciate just how good things are today relative to what they were back then. Like I think about what my parents must have had to go through when I was born in the 70s and what that would have been like, because they would have been growing up with insane inflation when I was born. And that would have been tough to get through. That would have been real. That would have been an anxious time. The Vietnam War was
an
going
anxious
on.
time.
It was difficult. And so, as it relates to property, the reason why I wanted to reach out, obviously, I read the book and I was aware of you from like almost 20 years ago. But should homeowners or investors actually use that to their advantage to build wealth?
Well, let's put it this way: if you knew that there was a boom not so far away, then that might influence your decision to, for example, even upgrade your home. Like I've got clients right now that are selling their home to upgrade. So they're going to double their investment in a home. They've got a $2 million house, they're going to go to a $4 million, right? Why would you do that right now? Well, actually, we're in a cyclical sweet spot because there's not much competition at that higher end in particular. So it's the perfect time to upgrade your home. And guess how many people aren't upgrading their homes right now? A lot.
Yeah. Almost
fact,
everybody I talk to don't want to do this. They want to wait till prices are already away.
In fact, that brings us to another point, which is a lot of people say, who drives property prices the most? It's investors, of course, yeah? Everyone says, yeah, right, true. Well, apparently it is, but when you look at the numbers, it's not. And it's not first home buyers either. It's actually upgraders, the people who already own a house. And for example, a few years ago, they were buying 20,000 properties a year. Now they're down to 10,000. And so it's halved. And if you look at investors, they were buying about 5,000, they're down to about 2,000, 2.5. So they've halved as well. But actually, when you bring those upgraders back into the market, and a lot of them are waiting, they've been waiting for interest rates to come down, right? They've spent more money on their houses, so they're actually worth more. So they've been waiting for that time to come back. They're actually the ones that are going to drive property prices the most, and they're going to turn up like a herd, like they're going to turn up en masse once they can borrow again. And that's not very far away. And once a bit of confidence returns in the economy, it's actually not that far away. So why wouldn't you want to know that as a homeowner? Or would you just rather, upgrade when the property market's booming, you can get more for your property, but now you've got to pay so much more for that other one? So the gap to upgrade right now is actually smaller than it should be. So it's a great time to do that. As a first home buyer, why would you want to listen to me and say, wow, there's a cycle, we're in a sweet spot. If you don't buy in the next year or so, you are really going to regret it in about 3 years' time when you look back and go, oh my gosh, missed opportunity. So it could actually even price you out of the market for several years. That's what happens, right? People don't act. And then they think it's too expensive because they read all the news, all these articles of people saying, oh, property's unaffordable, the median multiple, all of these reasons. They hold off buying thinking, oh no, they'll get cheaper. And then they're trapped. And 2 years later, they're like, oh, well, now we've got to save another $50,000 deposit. So, it just goes on and on. There are times when it's cyclically the perfect times to buy and sell. But those times, they're very hard to spot. But I think in terms of decades, Darcy, I've been in property for 40 years now. So I think in terms of decades now, not in terms of a couple of years like I did when I started out. And once you look through that lens of the cycle, you can then see that the little fluctuations that occur along the way that everyone says, oh, for example, I'll give you an example. If property prices are going down, everyone goes, oh, we're in a property slump. Property prices are going down. Actually, when you have that context of a decade looking at the entire cycle, you can see, are we really in a slump, or is this just one of those blips that we have during a boom when there's a pause and a pullback of prices because people are nervous that prices are too expensive and they've gone too far too soon? We could actually be in a boom when prices are going down, but also prices can go up during a slump as well. Doesn't mean they're going to stay up. They might go up by 10% and then come back down and stay flat for a year or two. But people misinterpret those little movements as being a phase of the cycle. That's why people think we're in a property slump right now. And I know you're going to ask me soon where I think we are cyclically. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that one.
Yeah. I'd like to take it back, though, to
Sure.
what you were saying about the upgraders. I get where you're going. I just want to pull out a little bit of a detail that I think is really important, just to make sure people understand why the upgraders are such a massive influence. And it's because they usually wait until it feels like it's time to do things. And usually that emotion kicks in when there's a bit of FOMO, but also it's when they remember not too distant past where it was possible to buy a larger home and then convert the existing home into a rental and then use that property, hang on to it for a while, like hoisting another sail to get there further, sell it off after that's gone up in value to repay the mortgage a lot more efficiently. And what they're doing when they do that is they're taking another property off the market, which then helps with the supply and demand imbalance during a period of time when the cost of money is historically low. So it's a very fascinating thing, like especially to hear you say that, Kieran, how it's not the first home buyers, it's not the investors, it's the upgraders that are probably the most responsible for fanning that into flame, right?
Yep. Because think about, herding. We're emotional beings. We herd like, we do. And
Hey, please pardon the intrusion on this conversation today. Good wealth building tactics using property need not be that complicated. Whether you're buying your first home, your next home, or you're building a portfolio of rentals, and whether you engage in a buy and hold strategy or something that exploits the principle of the property cycle like what we're talking about today, there's more than one path that you can go down. It can often be a little bit tricky, though, choosing the right strategy, especially when your significant other might think something different than you. If you'd like to learn more about how you can use property as a tool to build wealth and how you can use someone like myself to give you the strategy that will work well for your circumstances, then check out the link in the notes to make a free 15-minute chat with me now. Also, remember, if you want to get a copy of this book, Grow Richer with the Property Cycle, I have 2 copies to give away. If you're in Auckland and you're willing to come pick it up, flick me a message somehow and I'll get it into your hands. Let's get back to the show now.
And that herding instinct is strong, and they happen to be the largest portion of property owners. Everyone thinks it's property investors, or, it's not. It's actually the people living in their family home. They are the largest part of the herd.
Yes.
And when that herd starts to move, and this is exactly what people do, is they say, "Oh, prices are going up. We better upgrade our home." So there suddenly becomes a stampede, and the herd is quite fearful still at the moment. We've just come through a few years of the herd basically stalling and going, "Oh, it's too dangerous to move," right? But now the herd's hungry to move. There's a lot of pent-up demand for people who want to upgrade the home. When COVID was here, it was all great. We all stayed at home. We did up our home, made them better. We got used to it. But now we're a few years down the track and, life's changed. Either your family's growing or shrinking and your needs are changing. But we're not seeing those people move yet en masse.
Yes.
Once they do, that's what's going to drive property prices.
Okay. And again, staying on that theme, I would always say to the upgraders generally, and I still will, that the best time to upgrade is in a downward market.
Right now is a fantastic time to buy and hold your property and rent it out because we've got tax deductibility coming back fully. Of course, there's a little bit of uncertainty around the government. If we have a change of government, who knows what they'll do? They could change the rules again in respect of deductibility. Of course, a new build takes care of that, but not many people are living in a new build that want to upgrade their home, I don't think, right now. So, yeah, it's actually one of those wonderful times where you can actually buy the dream home in the dream spot for not that much more, bit of a stretch. If you can keep yours existing property, do it, because in a couple of years you're going to be thanking yourself when you sit and look at how your mortgage has gone down on that new home.
Yeah.
So, that it's the perfect time to do that. But unfortunately, many people can't achieve that in respect of borrowing the money.
That's right. I want to talk to you about the homogeneity myth. I just made that up. It's not a real thing, I'm sure. But properties aren't the same, right? We have housing stock available right now that would be perfect for first home buyers. We have do-ups versus done-ups. We have the $1 million price range, the 2 million range, the 4 million range, and they all have their own different supply and demand dynamics. Some properties will often attract buyers that have large amounts of debt behind them. Others won't. And so lending policy changes will affect different price bands at different price points as well.
Yeah.
It's very complicated, isn't it? But I guess when we hear stuff in the media about where the housing market is at, generally, because it's just practical to do so, they're converting the entire property market into one homogeneous good.
Correct.
And at the moment, we'll dig into this with the property cycle, because when you overlay the property cycle, different cycles will be good for different types of property, I would imagine, right?
Correct. The strategy for investors changes depending on where we are in the cycle.
Yeah, unpack that a bit, yeah.
And even when people go, "Oh, well, we're in a boom, so I should be doing this." But my question's always, well, where are we in the boom? Are we at the beginning, the middle, or the end? Because there's different strategies to employ depending on whether we're at the beginning, of the middle, or the end, right? So I want to buy land. I want a land bank at the beginning. If you say we're in the boom, but we're in the late boom, I'm not really that keen on land banking because I know what's around the corner. But if we're early boom, then that strategy is appropriate. So you've got to adjust the strategy. I'm talking about investors here,
Yes.
to suit where we are cyclically, but
Okay.
not just the phase, but actually which of those 3 stages are we in,
Yes.
because every phase has 3 stages that we go through. This is why I follow the cycle so closely, because in the 90s, I actually started to, as a banker, corporate banker, I started to recognize, and a property investor, I started to recognize some repetitive patterns in the property market. And I started to question, is there actually a property cycle? My colleagues at the time, I was working at Citibank, my colleagues all said, no, there's a business cycle and the property market follows that. But actually, when I overlay the data, and fortunately had access to a lot of data in the corporate banking field, when I went back a few decades, there wasn't a direct correlation between the property market and the business cycle. So that's when I started to say, is there a property cycle? And there wasn't, back in those days, the internet was fresh and there wasn't much information globally
You had to dig a
about
little bit
the
deeper,
even
right?
concept of
Right.
a property cycle. In fact, the the real wisdom I found was a book that was 60 years old, written in the 1930s, which actually was about 100 years of land values in Chicago by a great man called Homer Hoyt. And that book really opened my eyes, because even at the very end of that book is just incredible analysis. It's a very boring book, but it's got some really real gold in it if you're prepared to sift through it. But at the very end, even he said, I'm not sure if the cycle will continue or it's just a sort of an outcome of an emerging city, because Chicago was like
Right.
growing.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating to see that, 70 years later, 60 years later, the same principles still applied in respect of the property cycle, which really
It's fascinating. Yeah, it's almost like
amazed me.
the Fibonacci sequence, right? Or even just how patterns exist no matter what realm you look, and it's bizarre, but patterns are there. So
Well,
break it down though. What are the distinct phases before we get into the sub phases of each phase? What are the distinct phases of the property cycle?
okay, so we have a recovery, which is, I compare it to, the cycle of a day. So the cycle of a day is created by gravitational forces, right? So we all know that that's what turns the earth. So my question is, if we look at the property cycle in respect of it like being like a day, we have a morning where, activity starts to pick up after the long night of quiet, slow activity, starts to pick up, and then in the afternoon, so it's equivalent to the recovery as the morning. Then in the afternoon is the heat of the day. That's like the boom when things are really active, right? And then we enter the nighttime phase, which is the slump, where things start to shut down and everything kind of goes to sleep, like the property market, for example.
Yeah.
And then again the sun comes up and we have a recovery, and there seems to be a bit more activity, and then suddenly everyone's running around busy, right? So
Yes.
this is the cycle. It's a natural cycle. Everything in life is cyclical, but people kind of ignore the fact that our psychology is linked to being cyclical as well. And you talk about the Fibonacci sequence, and I've done some analysis based on historic property price movements, and I've found some interesting correlations in respect of you can tell roughly how far a market's going to fall based on how far it's coming and what time frame it's come once you start applying the golden ratio, basically.
Okay.
Because that's a law of balance, and everything gets out of balance and then comes back into balance and then gets out of balance again. It's just natural cycle. And the frustration I have in respect of the property market is we have governments turning up and going, no, we're going to make it linear. And it's not linear. You can't actually kill the property cycle. No matter how hard you interfere with it, the more you interfere with it, the more extreme it will be when the cycle finally comes back and says, I'm here, I'm taking back control, because you can't take control of me. And it seems to be embedded in our psyche as well. It's really quite fascinating.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
So whenever there's natural rhythms and cycle, and there's good parts to it and bad parts about it, there's going to be one group of people
Well, you
that
call
says,
it good and bad.
yeah,
But
that's
who's
true.
it, who's
Yeah,
it good
no,
for,
that's
right? Who's
yeah.
it good for and who's it bad for?
Well, I guess if you think about thermodynamics, energy is just transferred into another sphere, right? And so when you say it's a planet rotating, yeah, I was going to say a planet rotating around the sun. Yeah, that's right. So when a planet is rotating, then the heat isn't gone; it's just showing up somewhere else, and all of the factors that kind of coalesce to create this boom time or this bust time, it hasn't gone anywhere. Well, sorry, yeah, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's just moved to a different place than where you're currently looking.
And this is why there's times when first home buyers will be, the ones enjoying the season, and there's other times when it will be property investors enjoying the season. But unfortunately, in this country, there's a lot of envy politics around, property investors. So as soon as they're having their season in the sun, then all the blame game starts arriving.
Sure. So there's somebody behind the house stepping on the hose to stop it, but the pressure's building up because you can't fight the laws of nature, and
It's a
you just
universal law.
exacerbate it.
These are universal laws that we have politicians saying, I'm going to change this. That's why I see people interfering with the cycle, and I see the distortions that creates, and I'm like, yeah, but you can't kill the cycle. And they're like, no, we're going to get prices, on this nice level, slow growth equal to inflation and income growth over a long period of time. And I'm like, yeah, no, sorry, that doesn't work in nature.
Right. So with the previous cycle, we had things like the triple CFA, the removal of tax deductibility, we had high interest rates, we had a lot of new legislation that was imposed on property investors to make properties nicer. And some of these things are important, right? But there was a clear attempt, and they made it quite explicit. There was a clear attempt to bring property prices down. They were successful. And my question to you
For a
is
time.
kind of like leading on to what you were just saying. Do you think that that will exacerbate the next cycle that naturally would happen anyway?
Yeah, but it'll be bigger. It'll be bigger in a shorter space of time than what it would have been. So we've actually gone backwards a bit. But let me just go back to the cycle. As you know, the cycle of a day is driven by the gravitational forces from the planets and the sun. So what's the gravity of the property cycle? What is the gravity? It's actually, I boiled it down to a basket of key drivers, I call them. There's about 15 of them. And if you look at those, they collectively drive the market. Things like net migration, incomes, employment levels, there's a bunch of them, right? And if you watch those closely enough, like I do, they tend to reach peaks and troughs at certain times in the cycle. So, for example, net migration might peak usually in a boom and reach a low point, typically in a slump. But so that's the key drivers of the cycle. They actually drive us from the one phase into the next, okay?
Right.
But there's also this other basket of information which are called market influences. That's legislative changes, interest rates, inflation. And these things can change on a dime, whereas the key drivers tend to build momentum over time and reach a peak and then build, drop off that momentum and reach a trough. So they're quite consistent over a long period of time. Again, I think in terms of decades, not years. So when you look at them, you can actually see the trends move, and that's what actually drives the cycle through the phases. But the market influences, they are very rapid changing usually. So for example, interest rates, we saw what happened with interest rates going up or down and up really rapidly. And we know what the outcome of that was on the property market or property prices, but they don't actually drive the cycle. They can interfere with the cycle. And basically we had so many market influences on the back of COVID, which itself was a market influencer, that we seem to have forgotten that was a 1 in 100 year event, and all of these market influences that have been brought to bear on the property market since actually are not long-term. They're not going to have a long-term impact on the market. Market influences, their very nature, they usually have a short-term temporary impact, although as a result of COVID, they've been protracted impact on the property market. But ultimately, if you have strong net migration and you're not building enough houses, you're going to drive yourself into a property boom. But you do have to look at the key drivers collectively, not any single
hard, though,
key
right?
driver.
That's
It is
hard.
challenging.
Yeah.
And everyone talks about interest rates. Just watch interest rates. Actually, if you look at interest rates historically, interest rates, when they go up, they have an impact on people. But eventually, I've discovered this thing called the law of acceptance. And over time, people actually accept this is the new norm, and it stops influencing their behaviour. And I'll give you an example. It happened overseas. Capital gains tax is a market influencer because it's a legislative change. When it was introduced in Australia and the UK, for about 18 months, market stopped. Everyone's like, oh, property prices, no. After about 18 months, back to normal. Everyone goes, oh, of course you've got to pay a profit on, a tax on your profit. So it doesn't actually have that long term, but politicians seem to think that market influences can permanently influence the market. The Reserve Bank's done quite well in respect of using those, and now they've brought a new one to the table, right? DTIs. So they're making up new market influences to try and continue to sort of stall. But unfortunately for them, or for us, or fortunately, depending on where you are, that's only going to eventually result in a much bigger swing than would have occurred naturally. See, my view is if everyone understood the property cycle, and some people have said to me, it'd become really extreme if everyone knew there's a boom. No. It would actually level things out because people would be able to see a bit further ahead and say, oh, hang on, And I believe if everyone understood the cycle, had a basic view of it and knew where we were in the cycle, that it would smooth out the swings and drops. Because you only have those huge drops when you have the huge up, right? Mm-hmm. And you only have the huge up when you have the huge drop. So, what we've been led to believe is that our leaders are creating a stable property market. stability. They always talk about creating stability. Unfortunately, their influencing factors have created massive, massive instability like we haven't seen in my lifetime. Like the early 90s was a terrible time for our economy, massive recession. Everything suffered and property did too. We haven't had that on our economy this time. Definitely there's some dents, but the property market has suffered more than it did. And that's because of market influences.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I kind of think of the child on a swing going back and forth. It's almost cyclical, right?
You got it.
And then they're pumping their legs as well. And so you have this resonance in a sense, or this amplifier that if there's a cycle within a cycle, a wheel within a wheel, you get extra moves of momentum. And so what you're saying is these influencers are like wheels within wheels that are spinning. And I guess you could say even that COVID reset the timing of a lot of the influencers with these other things, right? These key drivers. So
Unfortunately, COVID was such a massive impacting factor that it actually had an immediate impact on the key drivers. Net migration disappeared. Property sales disappeared, right? Everything changed. It's a 1 in 100 year event. It's like unbelievable what's actually occurred, but it's been so extreme, and everyone seems to think now we're in this new place, a new world where everything will be nice. And I'm sorry, but that's not how cycles operate.
But we've been at the moment anyway. We're 4.5 years from March of 2020. It feels maybe this is just my interpretation of the media, but it kind of feels like mainstream media would allow us to think that, well, politicians, central bankers especially, would allow us to think that soft landing is incoming. We're now over that. It only took 4.5 years because they've done such a good job of it. Is that fair to say that?
Yeah, soft landing's over, but unfortunately it's not going to be a soft takeoff because they've made it, they've actually they've lined so many things up that it's going to be extreme. When our economy starts to improve, it's not going to be slow and steady. It's going to be erratic and stop-start and significant, and the property market's going to be the same.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we're told we will never have double-digit house price growth in a year again. Well, that myth will be blown away very, very shortly.
That's interesting. Okay, so you're predicting more volatility ahead.
More volatility because, it's like normally a market influencer is a pebble in a pond. So it has ripples and they ripple out pretty quickly. But COVID was a meteorite arrived in the pond, right? So it's still, we're still feeling the waves, the ripple effect, and people don't understand it. They think this is the new norm, but it's not. We're still suffering the ripples, and there's more to come.
Yes.
Because it's not over yet.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Going back to the cycle, recovery, boom, bust,
Slump.
slump. Sorry. So within each of those three distinct phases, there are sub phases. Do you want to break that down?
Three stages.
3 stages. Sorry.
Like anything, like any good story, it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the boom has a beginning phase, a middle phase, and an end phase.
Sure. So thinking about the first home buyer, because that's probably nicer just to stay on that. If we were to think about it from their perspective, what do the 3 stages look like?
The problem first home buyers have is when prices start going up, they frantically try to buy but can't because the prices are going up. And then when the slump arrives, everyone says you're nuts to buy a home. So, you might as well wait and save some more money. So unfortunately, they get pushed and pulled around the changes. But looking at a boom, if we cut it down into the 3 stages, at the beginning of the boom, there's usually quite strong growth, okay, very strong growth. Like the strong growth we had in 2020, people said we've never had such strong growth. And actually it was marginally higher than we have traditionally had at the beginning of a boom. And then there's a pause just before we go as we step into the middle stage. Okay. There's a pause usually because people are like, oh, how can property be worth that much when it was only worth this much a year ago?
Shell shock, right?
People are crazy. This is nuts. Shell shock, pause. And then everyone realizes, oh, hang on, but the economy's good and things aren't that bad. And, oh, those prices aren't actually, they're still within reach comfortably. So the market starts to pick up again. And first home buyers is when they really start to struggle because the prices are pushing up their need for a bigger deposit all the time, right? So that becomes a challenge. And you might also have some influencing factors like the Reserve Bank go, oh, property prices are going up too much, we better push up interest rates. So it makes it even harder for those first home buyers. And then, but prices still keep going up because there's still a load of pent up demand for people to buy properties, upgrade, invest, first home buyers. And then we reach the frantic stage, the last stage of the boom, where things just get a bit crazy, and it really does become highly unaffordable. And people investing in property, it's very expensive. It costs you a lot of money to hold that property if you're going to buy it, before we then enter into the slump. And the funny thing about a slump is prices don't always capitulate. Like in Auckland in 2016, when we stepped into the slump, prices, I knew it was going to be a mild slump. In fact, I did an event, a seminar, to a bunch of people, and I told them that this is going to be the mildest slump we've had in recorded history because of the unitary plan, which underpinned the value of many properties in Auckland. And it actually proved to be the case. It was the mildest slump. Prices barely dropped. They kind of just shut down and stayed pretty level. There was a little bit of a drop, not much.
Yeah.
And when you look historically at the last 4 cycles, you can see that was a very mild slump. Then we were actually stepping in, I know it's hard to comprehend, but we were actually stepping into our next boom just before COVID arrived. All of the key drivers were lining up to say, the boom's it's here, it's coming. And then COVID arrived. We all know what happened. No one could buy a property, sales volumes plummeted, everyone was scared, property's going to plummet. And then we had the turnaround when interest rates plummeted by the Reserve Bank, and suddenly a boom in prices, which we would have had anyway, but it was a little more extreme because interest rates were pushed to such an extreme level. And that only lasted about a year. And then everything changed again because prices were up. And then we know what happened. Mortgage rates got pushed up. And then people think we were pushed into a slump. It's hard to comprehend, I know, but we have not been in a slump in the last 3 years. We've been stalled at the early boom, which is where we still are in respect of the cycle. We're actually stalled, but we're just starting to move again. So the boom is about to recommence. People are going to go, there's a boom. It's about to recommence. But if you don't understand market influences and key drivers, it's hard to get your head around the fact that the cycle could actually be stalled. But that's what market influences can do. They can also accelerate the cycle. So if we're in a slump and interest rates are plummeted, they can push us through the slump quicker. And then the key drivers start lining up, and then we enter a boom. I know it's hard to comprehend, but because I've been looking through this lens of the cycle for 40 years, I'm like, it's like night and day. It's
so you've kind of answered the ultimate question, which is where we are in the cycle. So what you're saying is we are in an interrupted early boom.
Early boom. Many people think we're in the recovery or about to step into the boom.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I've naturally thought.
Well, we are in it. And if you think about it, prices are up from where they were in 2020, as they should be, but they're actually not up by that much. And then if you deduct inflation, real house prices are a lot cheaper today than they were 4 years ago, funnily enough. Yeah. But the dollar price is higher. And this is where people get confused because they just look at the dollar price.
Yeah.
And they don't understand that.
Yeah.
Also, the unitary plan, we would be remiss not to talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Because that was actually a market influencer, but it has a long impact because what it did is multiply the value of land in Auckland. And a lot of people got confused because they looked at a house in 2016, and, take a property out West Auckland, we could build 2 houses on it, and it was 700,000. So if you just look at the raw land value, it was 350 per site, right? Today, that same property is worth 1.2, 1.3, which is, people go, it's insane. It shouldn't be worth that much more compared to what it was. It's the same property, but actually now I can put 6 dwellings on it. So the site cost per raw land site is actually cheaper today. It's 200. It's nearly half the price it was in 2016. So actually, property's a lot cheaper today. Land is a lot cheaper today than it was before. The unitary plan had a double impact. It increased the value of properties that you could develop by a massive margin, but it also reduced the cost per site of land to build on. So it was a wonderful thing. But people don't understand that. They go, how can that house be worth 1.3 million when it was only 700, even 5 years ago? So this is where the confusion
Right.
comes from.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things I think that can confuse people, right? Like, what does this key driver actually mean? That kind of takes a little while to unravel that. What do you think though about the time that we are in these distinct phases? Like you said before, the recovery is generally pretty short, maybe a couple of years. The boom time,
It's elastic because it depends on how quick and how far prices go. They're not going to go through the roof and stay going through the roof for years on end. Okay, they have a time frame. If you go back to the cycle in the early 2000s, the boom started in 2002. That's the one I made my name by calling it before it actually arrived. In 2004, it stalled, and people were like, "Oh, prices are going to come down." Some people were saying prices are going to drop 20% or whatever. And I was looking at my research and telling my clients at the time, no, no, it's good. It's going to continue. The boom isn't over. And it stalled for about just over a year. And I started questioning after at the end of that 2004. I'm like, maybe I've just got this wrong, like maybe it's just throw it out and start again. But sure enough, prices came back in 2005. They went up 30% in the next 2 years. So that was the rest of the boom. So that boom got protracted. Why? Because there was a lot of media early in 2004 that the property prices had come too far too soon. It was crazy, insane prices. How could anyone pay that much? It's unsustainable. So that was just that emotional attachment to the dollar figure that caused a bit of a protraction of that cycle, which was great for us as investors because it gave us a window of opportunity within a boom, like we've got right now today. Actually, same thing,
yeah,
similar.
no, I know what you mean because I remember some of the stuff that you were putting out back then, early 2000s. That's when I got started in this industry, and I remember that, and I do remember the media and the economists. I kind of almost put them
Yeah,
in the same
yeah,
category because they were saying some pretty
yeah.
negative things around that time, and it was amazing just to see how that influenced people in the market that I was working in, still work in, which is probably medium to higher net worth individuals, a little bit more savvy, but very influenced by these, I
This is
guess,
the herd
yeah,
being herded by cats
yeah,
in
totally,
over here, right?
yeah,
Even though, and to be fair, those people with that view actually believe their view. So, but unfortunately, it's not a rounded view. It's somewhat naive view. I got used to get accused of looking at too much at the data, but actually you've got to do a bit of both. You've got to look at the data and be in the market, and then you get a really rounded view. So yeah, it's interesting watching the media, on a daily basis,
yeah.
chasing the herd around.
Yeah, yeah, because it's kind of happening now, and I know I try my best to play both sides, and I'm optimistic, but I'm also equally, I guess, suspicious or pessimistic with those that are in the media, and that includes people in our industry because that's what you can do now, and clearly there's something in it for them to pump their bags, and I get that. What you're kind of suggesting though is that they might be justified because these key drivers, these
Sometimes, yeah.
influencers, are kind of in alignment right now to kick things off. They might not be calling it right for the right reasons, though, is what I'm also picking up. Would that be fair?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter because the end outcome is the same.
Look, my view, I used to get accused of just always talking the market up, but actually, I don't care if, prices are going to go up or down. I'm going to call it like it is because I'm looking at a view, right? A cyclical view. So I can't always be saying, it's a great time, property prices are going up, going to keep going up. Years ago, I had a famous author write an introduction to one of my books, and they were talking about a market in America and how great it was, and it turned out that market like plummeted in the next couple of years, and I thought, wow, how wrong could you get it? But 5 years after that, actually prices had like tripled. So, you know,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Okay. How much of the local, obviously we have our neighborhood area, we have our city, we have our national piece, and there are these influencers and key drivers that you're watching here. How far do you zoom out? Because I start on the outside and I come back in,
I'm looking
but
at,
you can kind of go both ways.
I'm looking at 4 cycles,
You're looking at 4 cycles,
40 years.
40 years, yeah.
And then I'm looking at where we are now in relation to what's happened in previous cycles based on similar things. Everyone goes, oh, it's completely different now. But actually, no, it isn't. You know, it rhymes. It rhymes with the past. The
10,
elements
10
look a
years,
bit
more or
different.
less, is what you're saying?
About 10. It's not exactly a 10-year cycle. You know, there's points in time when you can argue it's been a 15-year cycle, and then 2 years later you can argue it's been an 8-year cycle because of what happened 10 years ago or 8 years ago. So it's very hard to, it's roughly 10. In New Zealand, it's been about between 8 and 12 years typically.
Sure.
But that's a big difference, right?
Yeah,
It'd
yeah.
be a big difference. And this one's going to be really interesting because it's quite long, because we had market influences that
Yeah.
stalled us.
How much does, and you mentioned this in your book, you mentioned government, central bank, and their policies. How much do you consider international things? So at the moment, I'm looking at bond yields, the price of gold. I'm looking at central bank alignment, geopolitical concerns
They're
as
big.
massive.
They're big because, you know, we in the 90s we had the Asian financial crisis where that hit us. Oh, in the 80s we had the share market crash that hit us.
87, 97. Yeah.
Yep. And then we had the GFC, which globally hit us, right? We've
2007.
had COVID, which is an international, you know, these are big events, but they tend to, it's odd how they tend to come around about once every decade, you know, there's some massive influencing factor.
Yeah.
Some of them have a bigger impact than others. You know, like the Asian financial crisis wasn't as big as what we had with the share market crisis or the GFC or COVID. But so some of them are not quite as impactful on our economy. So, but you do have to account for those. But I give them a light weighting because they don't happen on a regular basis. So you can generally see a big one coming in. Early 2008, I could see the GFC, which is why I made myself very unpopular in the real estate industry, because I called a crash, and sure enough, prices dropped 10% in the year. That's a crash. So, but you could see it coming because it was a global. The GFC had become such a big thing. It was kind of, you know, spreading around the world. So you could see it coming at us.
And so if you were to think about what comes next, what I'm hearing so far is that the boom shall recommence and last for a certain period of time.
I have some idea on how long it'll last and how much.
Do you want to share a bit more of that if you can?
Not at this point in time.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to put you on the spot then.
I understand, but I have to be careful because, you know, sometimes people misquote, take things out of context, and it's very easy to grab a little bite like that and go, oh, he said, right? And I did. So, no, I have a very clear view of how much growth we'll have in the next, I'll give you a rough time frame, I'd say probably 3 to 4 years, roughly. But I have a really good view of what growth we're going to have in that time. And I can tell you it's not insignificant. There will be some double-digit price growth years in there. And when you compound that over a period, you can start to work out roughly, guess roughly some numbers.
Yeah.
It won't be that extreme because we've had a massive dent of confidence, and a lot of investors that previously were quite, had a large appetite. The early boomers are now retiring and exiting. So I'm not sure the younger ones, although I am seeing people in their 30s and 40s saying, yeah, we want to do the property investment. But the younger ones, some of them have got a really tainted view, I think, of investors, and that's been sort of a view that's been sort of manicured for certain people for their own benefit. Rather than a more rounded view that actually we're providing a social service. And, you know, we come back to the social housing problem that the government's got. They're not really doing a good job of looking after their own stuff, and they're expecting us to do it, and then they're blaming us for doing it. It's like, hang on,
Make up your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something I did want to touch on about timing, because a lot of people say, yeah, Kieran, it's all great, but it's time in the market, right? Everyone knows time in the market beats timing the market. But let's just pull that apart. If you have a look at the context of that statement, who made it? And what was it about? Was it about the property market? No.
No, about share
No,
market, right?
it's a billionaire called Ken Fisher.
Right.
And what he said was, he made that statement because he was talking about investing in shares on a regular basis over a long period of time. It's called dollar cost averaging. And if you apply that method, then it doesn't matter if you buy some when the market's low and some when it's high. It's irrelevant because you're only investing small amounts on a regular basis, right? Like our super Kiwi Saver, right? Same thing. So he was talking about that context. But people grab that statement and go, oh, look, timing doesn't matter in the property market. Yeah, but hang on, let's look at the property market. How often do we invest in the property market or buy a home? Wow, very irregular. And it's a huge amount of money. So, of course, timing starts to become quite important, right? Because you're talking about making a massive, if you go and put all of your money in the share market today, you're taking that same risk, right? So timing is very important when it comes to property. And it's not a race between timing and time in. Everyone talks like you've got to have one, which one wins, which one's better. It's not about that. They actually complement each other perfectly. Okay, so it is timing. That's very valuable in property. But if you get your timing, better than it could have been, then you're way ahead of where you would have been. So they complement each other. They don't
That's
compete.
important, right? And I think again, there's all sorts of motivations behind the people that will bring these stories to the table. But I guess if you could just do a little bit of thinking about where we are at in the cycle and make some reasonable assumptions, then why not buy when the market is beat up a little bit, especially if you can control your purchasing decision. But I guess the fundamental issue is that most of us cannot control most of our actions because emotions usually rule our decisions. And so that's the issue, right? Most of us can't be counter-cyclical.
And the ability to borrow, because often at the very best times, your ability to borrow is restricted, right? Yeah. It's the old umbrella comes out in the sun, and then when the rain arrives, it's gone. So, I've been
post GFC, we saw that, right?
Yeah, I suffered that with a bank giving me this massive umbrella, and then just before when I said I need it, and they pulled it off me. So, I suffered that myself.
I want to ask you about that because that was one of the cool parts of the book where you actually shared one of your stories where things didn't go well. Would you be comfortable with unpacking that?
The only time I ever lost money on a property, but it was $500,000.
And that would have been a lot more money back then than it is now. So yeah, tell me what happened there.
It was deep. I wanted to invest in a property in a fantastic location, it was multiple income, but the owner owned the property next door as well, and they said, if you buy one, you've got to buy two, right? And I'm like, I don't want to buy two. But I might find someone else who'll buy the other one, right? So I did find someone else who I knew who signed up to buy the one which I didn't want, and I just didn't want it, so I'd already sold it. Took a long-term settlement, 6 months, went overseas, had a great holiday, travelling around Europe, came back. This person came to me and said, oh my God, I can't settle. I'm like, what do you mean you can't settle? We're unconditional. No, I've lost my job. I can't get the money. So now I'm in a dilemma. Do I force them to buy it, which I could have legally, and that would have been very ugly for them.
A friend of yours?
Yeah, it would have been very ugly. So I took a deep breath and said, okay, I'll rip up the agreement. And the lawyer said, you can't do that. I said, sorry, but him and I made the agreement. We're ripping up the agreement. So we did. So I took the property, tried to sell it, couldn't, because the market had turned while I was overseas. It was 2008. And it was a bit worse than that, because when I went to the bank, I said, I need to do both of them. And they said, okay, we'll give you, your 90% loan on the two properties. It was a couple of $1 million, a lot of money back then.
Wow.
And then 7 days before settlement, think about this, 7 days before settlement, this is a major trading bank, said, sorry, Kieran, we can't fund these properties. I said, pardon? I said, I'm settling next week. They said, no, we can't fund it. I said, well, you've really put me in a bind now, because what am I supposed to do? Because I can't get the money from anywhere else now. Everyone's shut down. They're lending. They said, oh, well, reluctantly they did one at 80%. So then I had to go to a second tier lender to get another 80%. So I had to find, in 7 days, I had to find $100,000 cash, which I scratched up, borrowed it. That was hard work, because no one had money then. Everything was like in a downward spiral. So it really put me in a difficult position. And then I spent the next 18 months trying to sell that property, and I couldn't give the thing away. And it just chewed me out. It cost, a fortune in monthly mortgage payments that I was funding. Yeah, absolutely. It was just cleaning me out. And then I finally got to a point where I said, Something's got to give. I need to get out. So I had to sell both of them, and I dropped 250 on what I paid for it, but I'd also spent 250 propping it up for 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah,
you
so
were
that was
throwing good
half a
money
million,
after bad.
$500,000.
$500,000 down the
And
river.
that was a big. I learned some really important lessons from that, but I still don't regret letting that person off the hook, because I did a good thing. I can sleep really comfortably at night,
And you
even though
knew
it was
that you could build back, but
it's hard.
maybe they couldn't have. It was hard work, though,
It
wasn't
was hard to build back, but yeah, I
Yeah.
did eventually get there. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was I could sleep at night comfortably knowing
Yeah.
that I'd done a good thing and a right thing. And after all, Darcy, I know it's a strange thing, but it's only money. And everyone says, oh, yeah, but it's easy to say that when you've got it. It's hard when you haven't. Yeah, but no, it was a lot of money, okay? But it is only money. And, when you lose money, you don't really lose anything of true value, okay? It's more like character. And I feel really happy about what I did for somebody else. So that I live with that.
And you can sleep.
Yeah. I just have a really clear view of what I did and why I did it.
Yeah.
And I knew at the time, I thought, wow, this is going to be, but I didn't know it was going to be quite so deep.
Yeah.
But I still would have done it if
Yeah.
I'd known.
And one of your quotes around that, or one of the lessons I think that you said that you learned, is that sometimes your first loss is the best loss you should take.
I actually had been taught that in corporate finance. Your first loss is your best loss. But when I took the property to auction, made an offer. And it was a couple of hundred I would have dropped. And at that point, I thought that's too much. But
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was going to be quite so deep,
Yeah.
the slump,
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just highlight something else there, right? Is that cycles within cycles, wheels within wheels, right? You have a lending cycle. And back then, because it was triggered by the global financial crisis, I remember this was really hard. Like instantly overnight, banks were not giving away cash sweeteners. They were charging fees. Loan to valuation ratios were dropping, not because of what the Reserve Bank was necessarily doing, but because bankers were just being bankers. They were exercising their discretion like
By the way,
they
by
should.
the way, if that bank had honoured the agreement that they'd made me in writing, I wouldn't have had to sell either property, because I could have actually floated through.
Which is another thing I think that people don't realize, is that even written approvals
Can get cancelled the day of settlement. The bank has all the rights, and that was just really, really frustrating to be in that position. I'm not the only one who suffered like that, but
No,
the
I know
banks,
of a few.
there's a lot
Yeah.
to be answered for. I think there. It's a bit harder for them to do that these days, I think, because there's a lot more regulation, and the banking ombudsman's a lot more, I think, sympathetic after COVID, right, to borrowers. But back then it was just cut and thrust.
Yes.
You're out the door, and
Yeah.
too bad.
But that is one of the differences now, is that generally speaking, credit is still available. And so really, if interest rates drop, it's game on. And I kind of, like, I look at this from a slightly different perspective, I guess, when I just think about it from an economic and credit thing. You merge those two things together. It feels like in New Zealand, right or wrong, property is the conduit by which new credit creation comes into existence. And it has to function, because new credit creation is effectively what underpins a lot. It's the grease, right? If that stops happening, things seize up.
People talk about the New Zealand economy being, a property market, a Ponzi property market, and it's like it's such a wrong view, because look, if I want to borrow money for my business and I go to the bank, do you know what they say? What property have you got for us? They're not interested in lending me against my intellectual property or my assets of a business. They don't care about that. They're like, well, it's worthless to us. Where's your property? And then we'll give you a business loan. So the whole structure is based on that. So you can't say, it's a Ponzi scheme for property, because you have to have property to be able to borrow money from a bank. Look at how much they actually lend on mortgages versus anything else. And it's a stark difference. And that's because they argue, well, that's where our risk is minimized. So we can lend against buildings.
Yeah.
Because it's a lower risk, right? And we all know why it's a lower risk. People have to live somewhere, right? But assets of a business can be thrown away. They're worthless overnight. But a property, someone can actually occupy it and live in it, and we all have to live somewhere.
That's right.
In the early 90s, when we had that deep recession, I was in a bank, and a lot of businesses went under, and I saw businesses move out of their big business premise when the lease expired and into a post office box. Now, I've never met anyone who moved out of their home to live in a post office box, and that's the difference. People have to live somewhere. That's why residential real estate is such a great investment, because it's so secure, right? Yeah, the value might plop around a bit, but it's still got that inherent value that someone has to actually occupy, and that's one of our basic human needs.
Yeah. Every financial system has a base layer. Here it's property.
That's right.
You can throw away the lemonade stand, but you're not going to, move out of your home. So, of course, you're going to have to give up that, put some skin in the game. Awesome. So as we come in for a landing here, we've talked about the upgraders, how now is probably a really good time to upgrade in a downward market. We've talked about first home buyers, dispelled that myth that it is unaffordable. What about property investors? What could we say to property investors from a cyclical point of view, and kind of allude to maybe a bit of a strategy here that one might use?
For a newbie investor, I would say you've got a choice of buy a new build. If you want something that's hands off, low maintenance, forget about it, put your money on the table, let it work for you. You could get a new build. There's plenty of those available right now, and they're really cost effective. Actually, you can buy them a lot cheaper than it costs to build them now.
Yeah.
So that's not going to last forever. Or if you're a bit more hands on, you could buy a do up and do it up, but be careful, because if you're going to do it up, the golden rule, you've got to make $3 in value for every dollar you spend. So if you spend $1, you've got to put it up by $3 at least, right? So you're going to spend 10,000, you need to know it's worth 30,000 more. That's ideal. You don't just want to get your money back on a do up, but it also can have an impact on the rent, so it can push the rent up, which is always good.
And price band if you get into a different part of the market, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. So in a do up, the best is a 2-bedroom to 3-bedroom if you can, within an existing floor plate. That's a real winner of a strategy. If you can get the numbers to work, but you've got to run the numbers. It's all about running the numbers. I can run the numbers on the back of a napkin and have done for decades. And that's always, if you can't do that, you need to really question, do you actually know what you're doing? The alternative for investors, if they've got deep pockets, existing investors, I'm encouraging them right now to land bank, buy land, because it's too cheap. We shouldn't be able to buy those properties for 1.3 million that you can put 6 houses on. Okay, so you just shouldn't be able to buy it that cheap. So it's not going to stay that cheap either, because I'm not sure many people realize, but the unitary plan actually gave us enough sort of land to build on for the next sort of 20 or 30 years, but a lot of sites aren't very user friendly. So they're either steep, they're a weird shape, the services aren't close. At the moment, we can cherry pick really nice properties, services either on or close, a nice shape, got everything we need, contour, no floodplain. We can actually cherry pick some really nice deals at the moment. I'm doing this for some investors now, and then build a 6-pack on it.
Yeah.
And people say, well, why would you want to do that? You're going to spend $3 or $4 million or something. And I'm like, well, 20 years ago, a lot of people used to say to me, I wish I owned that block of flats in Mount Eden, 6 flats or whatever. And I did a grid search of Mount Eden because I wanted to buy a block. And I found in a 2-kilometre radius, there was only like 8 blocks that were still owned by one entity. So all the others had been cut up into separate titles, or they might own 3, but someone else owned 1 and 1. There was only 8 in all of Mount Eden that were actually owned by one, the single entity. And most of them had owned them for decades. And I actually went through a process, a grid search, I called it. And I wrote them a written offer every 6 months and adjusted the price, trying to buy one, right? And only one came back to me at one stage and he said, you must be joking. So, I was desperate to buy, but I couldn't. Today, you can actually create your own by buying a property, building your 6-pack, brand new, low maintenance. By the time you finish it, it'll be pretty close to self-funding, assuming interest rates are still around the 5% mark. So, this is a window of opportunity that exists right now, and it's not going to last. And I might be encouraging some people to go out there and do it, but good luck. You need to be very careful, because you've got to qualify the property really well. You've got to have a good construction company next to you that's giving you a reasonable deal. And if you want, you can do it hands off, because they can do everything for you, which is what I'm focusing on, because My clients they don't want to learn how to become a developer. Some people do, that's cool. There's the development club with John Kennell,
that's right.
perfect.
Yeah.
If you want to become a developer, go there, amazing. But if you want hands off, you don't want to know about it, but you want the benefit of it and share a bit of that benefit, because you're going to need someone to manage that process for you, but you'll get the six pack at the end. And that's a legacy, right? That can see you through 20, think about in 20 years time when you've still got that six pack, that's an amazing legacy to have in your family.
Yeah.
And that opportunity exists right now, but it didn't 20 years ago.
Yeah.
10 years ago it didn't, but today it does. And in 10 years time, you won't be able to either, because the price will no longer be that effective for you to actually achieve it. Plus the build cost will be a lot higher. Who knows, we'll probably be quad glazing by then or something ridiculous, the windows.
Well, it certainly seems easier building that kind of six pack than that kind of six pack, right? So I'm looking forward to that. That's cool though. Okay.
No one else can build this six pack for you, but you can get someone
That's
else
right.
to do
Yeah.
that.
Well, I must look into that.
So yeah, there's a bit of a range for investors. To just buy a standalone house on a small section, an older house, it's not really, the numbers aren't really there, at the moment. So
Okay.
the new builds are where the money's at. That's where the money is.
Nice. Awesome conversation. It's been a long time coming, this conversation. So again, anybody who wants to reach out and grab one of these, I guess I've got 2 copies to give away. I'm not going to give away the one that I have. But yeah, if anybody wants 2 copies, let me know. The first to get in contact with me and who's willing to come and pick it up, because I'm too tight to actually put it in the post, then you're welcome to it. Just let me know.
And just remember, it's a reference guide. So I when I wrote my first book, Grow Rich with the Property Cycle, 2004, 20 years ago, my greatest fear was that people would flick through it, go, yeah, I've got it, and put it on the bookshelf, and it would gather dust, and 10 years later they'd pull it out and go, oh, geez, I wish I'd kept an eye on this, right? And that fear actually materialized, because I actually had people say to me that very thing when I've seen them after, because I haven't seen them for 10 years or something, and I bump into them and they're like, oh yeah, the book, I wish I'd kept looking at that. And I've had other people who said to me, every January I pull that, after Christmas, in the new year, I pull the book out and I look at where we are. I just flick through it to see roughly where we might be, right, cyclically. And that's really beneficial. So it's a reference guide. It's something to refer back to.
Sure.
It's not a book you read from cover to cover and go, yeah, I've got it.
That's right. Yeah. And you've written it in that like that so that you can start anywhere you want, really. Where can people go to find it, to buy one?
Whitcoulls.
So it's in Whitcoulls.
And it's online, Whitcoulls online.
Okay. Do you have a website as well that you can refer people to?
I've got my own website, tellmethetime.co.nz.
And that's for people that want to engage with you on more of a mentor level?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can see there roughly what I'm about and what I do.
That's good.
And
follow you on LinkedIn as well.
I don't sell the books though online. Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. That's my social media profile. I have a lot of followers there, and I put out, actually people keep telling me, they love the bits of information I put out, because I don't parrot. There's a lot of parroting going on about the property market and the trends and the latest bit of data, and there's a lot of micromanaging as well, like, sales were up last month, and suddenly that is interpreted as being, taking us into a boom or whatever. So, I give people, my information gives people a bit of more of a rounded view.
Yeah. Do your own due diligence. Awesome.
Cool. Thank
very
you so much for
Kieran.
having me. Appreciate it.
Likewise.
Yeah. Okay.